When I was speaking in South Carolina last month, there was a crowd of people around me at the end of the conference, and a little lady scurried up to me and pressed a folded pieces of paper into my hands, one of those sort of beware the Ides of March kind of moments. And I stuck it in my pocket, and in that church, that happens to me when I go there. Someone hands me a book or hands me a slip of paper or quote or something. And on the way home, I unfolded it and read this poem that I thought was important enough to base a sermon on and to share with you today. It's by Vincent Silliman. Let religion be to us life and joy. Let it be a voice of renewing challenge to the best we have and may be. Let it be a call to a generous action. Let religion be to us a dissatisfaction with things that are, which bids us serve more eagerly the true and the right. Let it be the sorrow that opens for us the way of sympathy, understanding, and service to suffering humanity. Let religion be to us the wonder and lure of that which is only partly known and understood, an eye that glories in nature's majesty and beauty, and a heart that rejoices in deeds of kindness and of courage. Let religion be to us security and serenity because of its truth and beauty, and because of the enduring worth and power of the loyalties which it engenders. Let it be to us hope and purpose, and a discovering of opportunities to express our best through daily tasks. Religion uniting us with all that is admirable in human beings everywhere, holding before our eyes a prospect of the better life for humankind, which each may help to make actual. Amen. For years, I've taunted Sean with my second favorite Voltaire quote, in which the French rationalist made the observation that anything that is too silly to be said is sung. So today I'm using a hymn lyric as the wisdom lesson, but Sean tells me that the music is too difficult to be sung, so we just read it. But you typically don't really want to look too hard at the lyrics of either opera or high church music. I mean, that's not a lie. You really don't want to look at it too hard because it really doesn't make any sense. Of course, a great hymn, a really great hymn, starts with a great poem. And I may be stepping outside any legitimate claim I have to any expertise to offer an opinion either about great music or great poetry, but for me, a great poem expresses an important idea more succinctly than prose. A poem that has to be explained is almost like an abstract art painting that you have to read the title to know what you're looking at. If I can't look at it and it communicates something to me, then it may be an exercise of ego on the part of the artist or the poet, but at least from a consumer vantage point, I don't think it belongs on the list of classics. A great poet or a great artist is a person who has an important insight that they are struggling to express in the most tight, succinct, unavoidable, and powerfully clear way that they possibly can. I've accepted the challenge of trying to write a TED Talk, which TED Talks ask people of various different professions to try to pull together what they have been trying to say in book after book after book, in lecture after lecture, semester after semester, conference after conference. What is it in your life that you are trying to say, and say it in 18 minutes or less? Which for me is like turning preaching into poetry, to try to get it all into one talk. I've got right now about 4,000 pages of sermon material online. But if I were to take those 4,000 pages and try to draw it down to 5 or 6 pages, what would I put in those pages? The old iterations of religious faith that were based on ancient texts, creeds, myths, traditions, and truth claims has no future in a rational, scientific, and fact-based world. That's the first thing that I'm trying to very clearly say. The mere fact that there are in our age megachurches in major cities and all over the flyover portions of America that still cling to both ancient and modern myths does not mean that such belief systems will retain any power in the future of our lives. I would even argue they don't retain much power in the lives of the people that still parrot those beliefs, because it doesn't seem to have much actual impact in how they vote, how they think, how they legislate, or how they conduct business. Now, I have to admit that the demise of magical religious thinking has been predicted by rationalists and humanists in the French Revolution, in the American Revolution, in various experimental movements throughout the world over the past 300 years. And the prediction of the death of traditional religion has been shown to be false century after century, because the church has always managed to reassert its authority in some parts of our globe. But I think this time, it's three strikes. I think it is ending, and is ending in our lifetime. The modern emergence of Islamic fundamentalism is, in my estimation, the last really big gasp of the death of magical religious thinking. It's fueled both by legitimate and illegitimate cultural anger. But I believe this is true, and nobody here can prove me wrong, that Islamic fundamentalism is being fueled by oil revenue, which oil revenue wasn't that great 100 years ago. We've come through a century in which crude oil has become the currency of the world, and it has caused a huge transfer of wealth from the developed world to oil-producing countries. But that economic bonanza isn't going to last. The Middle East, Indonesia, as well as Central American and Russian producers of crude oil, that bonanza has a shelf life, and it is coming to an end. Most of us here today will live to see the end of gas stations, and the oil-based economy and the inevitable shift in power. It's going to cause a huge upheaval in the world. The whole world population is going to be placed at risk, but it's going to change. And it'll either change by clever technological advances, or by more primitive environmental disasters, or by the mere exhaustion of the supply of crude oil. But as the global map and economy changes, I'm going to say the religious world will change too. That once the money moves out of crude oil production, Islamic fundamentalism will evaporate. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are all way overdue for major reformation. And I would love for that reformation to come about as a result of critical thinking, but it will come about. It may have to come about through economic necessity, but that kind of social transformation is going to take place. Either way, the best way that we can fight radical Islamic terrorism is to put up wind generators and solar panels. Bombing ISIL, Wahhabism, or Al-Qaeda would be totally irrelevant if we stopped buying oil. That would end it. In any event, my first point is that traditional religions rooted in ancient texts, myths, and magic will go away, because they will all be repeatedly revealed, not only to not be true, but they are incapable of interpreting the meaning of our lives. They no longer make sense in telling us what the rules for living are. And to sum up this point, since I mentioned that my second favorite quote was when Voltaire said, "Whatever is too silly to be said is sung," let me conclude with my favorite Voltaire quote: "Those who can persuade you to believe in absurdities can also get you to commit atrocities." Or to put it in the words of the great comedian George Carlin, Governments don't want you to be well-informed. They don't want well-educated people capable of critical thinking. That's against their interest. They want you to be obedient workers, people who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept it. I hate to have to say this, but traditional religious indoctrination is the opposite of teaching critical thinking skills. Teaching children from an early age to simply believe what they are told in spite of the fact that absolutely all of the evidence is to the contrary produces a society that has genuine and sincere difficulty in telling the difference between fact and fiction. One need only give a little attention to our public political news to find all of the evidence you would ever need to realize that a huge portion of our society will believe the most ridiculous, false, dishonest, self-serving lies only because they've been told these things by an authority figure. That more than 25% of our society is enthusiastic about the campaign of Donald Trump is an indication of how low our thinking skills have become. I believe that the practice of religion has done a great deal for the evolution of our culture, but we also have to honestly acknowledge that religion has done a great deal to the evolution of our culture. The question for me is it possible to hold on to safeguard, to preserve what has been helpful about religion while discarding what has been indisputably damaging, toxic, harmful to society? Which leads me to my second point. Our generation will face a choice. Shall we abandon faith communities entirely, or can we evolve into an entirely different community that will be relevant and will exercise powerful influence on the future? In 1822, nearly 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson predicted that there is not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian. The growing Enlightenment, coupled with the persuasiveness of the rational use of the scientific method, gave Jefferson confidence that magical and superstitious thinking was going to expire in his lifetime. He thought he was seeing it. He thought it was ending. And truly, at that point, fewer than 2% of Americans actually attended church. So he had lots of good reasons to think it. But it should be noted that in Europe and Great Britain, where the devotion to traditional expressions of Christianity has been disappearing for 3 generations, the Unitarian movement is shrinking even faster because most people are choosing none as their reply to polls about religious affiliation. In fact, one of the fastest growing religious identities on the census questionnaires in Great Britain is Jedi Knight. And just to be clear, that's not because there's a generation hoping for a flight on the Millennium Falcon. What they're telling us is that they think it is a silly question. And if the question is, will you invest in a religion that believes in angels and demons, heaven and hell, souls and spirits, a supernatural theistic God who grants wishes from the clouds if only you ask often enough, and really, really, really believe in fairies, then yes, it is embarrassingly silly. But is there another option? Is the choice only between absurdity or nothing at all? Or is there a rational, evidence-based, critical thinking version of religion that can both meet the needs of 21st century people and help to guide us into the birth of the real modern world? The world where everyone has health care and adequate food and housing and education and safety. Can we not become the ethical, critical thinking community that helps to give birth to that world? Now, there's no shortage of historical examples of governments using religion as a means of controlling their population, keeping them obediently harnessed in the plow of supporting the wealth of the powerful and of creating an aristocracy. But I can assure you that none of the world's great religions started that way. If there's even a shred of truth to the Moses tradition, he was a liberator of slaves and a slayer of slave owners. The precursor to modern Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that Persian religion known as Zoroastrianism, invented concepts of heaven and hell not as a carrot on a stick to keep the poor in line, but as a promise that one day the universal scales of justice would be balanced, and the poor Persian slaves would be able to see their masters burning in a lake of fire. There's some satisfaction in that, even if it isn't true. The ancient constructs were rife with wish fulfillment dreams, but they were born in a cauldron of deep desire for a more just society. All of the great religions of the world started in advocacy of the poor and the oppressed, and every one of them have been prostituted to serve the wealthy and the government. But they started in a very different place. There've always been some religious leaders who understood the role of faith as a moral guide, that resisted wars, that advocated for the oppressed, that sought to liberate slaves, to free people from the chains of racism and sexism and homophobia and poverty. You think of Muhammad, who, though he had access to great wealth, lived in a tiny little house and wore shabby clothing because he felt that a true religious person would always identify with the poor. Now, he was succeeded by opulent caliphs who took their opportunity to exploit the poor and live in great wealth, but Muhammad didn't do that. When you think of faith leaders, you have to think more of St. Francis than you think of the Pope. We have examples like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day, who should offset the outrages of the Joel Osteens and Benny Hinns of the world. But what I want to remind you of is that there would be no Gandhis, there would be no Kings, there would be no Dorothy Days if there are no more faith communities. If the nuns win choice of none, not N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, if the choice of no religion at all comes to fruition, then great spiritual leaders will simply never exist. My belief is that faith communities are to social ethics what labor unions are to the labor movement. A group of individuals who remain as individuals, who have grand beliefs about what fair wages and safe working conditions and in the importance of health care and pension funds, as individuals, they remain powerless. When they organize, they can change things. You think about the Great Salt March. If Gandhi had gone on that Salt March in 1930 all by himself, he would have just been a crazy, skinny little man who walked 240 miles. But he wasn't alone. He arrived at the seashore with 12,000 people marching with him, which changed a crazy little man into a social movement that brought liberty to a subcontinent. William Schultz, a Unitarian minister who was the founder of Amnesty International, said that the mission of faith is to revere both the critical thinking mind and the generous heart. We have to be able to marry critical thinking to radically compassionate feeling. We must turn our critical thinking into action. And though I would never disparage individual action, I'm confident that we are going to have collective action if we're going to see the kinds of reformation or even revolution that the world really is calling for. Now, communities of faith may not survive the 21st century, but I believe we need them. I'm going to keep with the tradition of old preachers in that hermeneutic tradition of having 3 points. I have a third and final point. And for that point, I will hearken back to the poem I began with today that enjoins us to let our religion be life and joy. Now, I know that joy is not a word that you often associate with religion. In fact, religion has more often been associated with guilt or fear, much more than it's been associated with joy. The saints often seem to be suspicious of happiness, always listing sins, great and small, with a lot of emphasis on the small ones. Our society seems to obsess about Puritan values at the same time that we privately are jumping off the cliff into the abyss of excesses of drugs, pornography, greed, and gluttony. The information superhighway, the truly marvel of the creation of the last generation, is still mostly used for porn traffic, and social media has taken the place of being social. We have a dozen different drugs on the market now for erectile dysfunction. We even now have a testosterone cream to make you want to take the pill. So senior citizens' homes are now rife with sexually transmitted diseases. And some of us have thousands of social media friends, but there still isn't much joy, is there? There's comfort, there's distraction, there's entertainment, we have activities, we have diversions, but I don't see much joy. Do you? I don't. Kids have joy, but we use school and church to beat it out of them. We take joy out of life and then saddle them with a job. Several years ago, I was taking a sabbatical from church work as a Merrill Fellow at Harvard Divinity School. And while there, I took a course in world religions with Diana Eck, which I highly recommend to anyone that could do that. When we were studying Buddhism, she had a monk in as a guest speaker, the Ven Lama Migmar. And it was 2004, so we were asking Lama Migmar a lot of questions about terrorism, about our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And though it was all very serious, he just had this gentle smile on his face and all the replies. And it almost felt like he thought we were silly. You know, he was just smiling at us while we were asking about these horrible things. So someone finally said, "What are you smiling about?" And his response was that the smile is a gift that monks give to a world that is filled with violence and fear and pain. Their joy, the joy of the Buddha, is a gift that they choose to give, no matter what's going on around them. I believe that the old forms of faith must pass away, and frankly, the sooner the better, because the world needs for us to bring critical thinking and a passion for justice to a whole host of issues of racism, poverty, warfare, environmental degradation, terrorism, diseases. But folks, we've got to figure out how to take that journey joyfully. We have got to find joy in it. We sing about love being our religion. We sing that love is all we need. We come from a tradition, at least, where we called each other's brothers and sisters. We bought this building from a Jehovah's Witnesses congregation, and we eradicated most Jehovah's Witnesses references, except the restroom doors, which I left as brothers and sisters, because at least the echo of that familial sense that we really ought to see each other as family. We talk about our community, but we don't see a lot of love, fraternity, and joy. I want to say that this has got to become a non-negotiable aspect of any future that faith has in the world. We have to choose it, even when we don't feel it. We choose it. We work for it. We nurture it. We feed it. We must exercise our strengths in tolerance and forgiveness and reconciliation and mutual respect, discovering the sacred in one another so that we will have the joy to sustain us in the revolution that surely must come. The Buddha in me must recognize the Buddha in you. The Christ in me must greet the Christ in you. I believe in the social justice mission of the 21st century church, and I want to be a part of it, as long as it's joyful. Without joy, I'm afraid that the cares of this life will just make cynicism win every time. To be fully informed is to be bitterly cynical unless you choose otherwise. Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.